Greetings everybody, Dragon here, and since I recently rewatched season 1 of Iron Fist, plus there being some rumors about an Iron Fist appearing in the upcoming Eyes of Wakanda animated show, I thought it was a good moment to do a comparison between the show and the comics. But before I start, here is a small summary of the comic book version of Iron Fist. The story begins with a 9-year-old Danny Rand being on a trip with his parents Wendell and Heather, plus his dad's business partner Harold Mitchum. While on this trip in the Himalayan mountains, Harold murders Wendell in an attempt to win over Heather, thing that obviously doesn't work, so he leaves Danny and his mother stranded. Desperate, Heather and Danny try to find shelter, but before they can go too far, a pack of wolves start hunting them down. While escaping the wolves, they manage to stumble upon a mysterious bridge, and in an attempt to save Danny's life, Heather decides to sacrifice herself to the beasts. After, a group of warriors slay the animals and take Danny into the mythical city of Kunlun. There, Danny is greeted by the city's leader, titled the August Personage in Jade, also known as UT, who offers the young boy anything he wants. Danny, filled with rage, tells him exactly what he wants: revenge on the men that murdered his family. Because of this, UT reluctantly offers Danny training, so he may acquire the skills to fulfill such tasks. 10 years later, Danny has not only become a master of Kung Fu, but also the latest wielder of the power of the Iron Fist. With his skills and power, he decides to leave Kunlun in order to finally take revenge on Harold. But when he finally catches up to the men, Danny finds out that in an ironic twist of fate, after Harold left him and his mother to die, he himself became lost in the frozen tundra, eventually succumbing to the harsh climate and losing his legs because of it. To make matters worse, while recovering in a small village near the mountains, he learned about the survival of Danny and his mission of revenge. So he spent the next 10 years obsessively preparing for their fateful encounter, but all the stress and paranoia left him as a hollow shell of a man. Danny, after learning all of this, can't help but to see himself somewhat reflected on Harold, how obsession twisted them both and pushed them down a road of fear, hate and anger. So after having this epiphany, Danny decides to spare him. But Harold, incapable of letting go of his obsession, even though he was spared, proves Danny right, and in a petty move attempts to shoot him in the back. Yet again, in an ironic twist of fate, a mysterious figure kills him and saves Danny's life. After this, Danny is left to wonder what will the future hold for him now that he is no longer shackled by the chains of revenge. Now to start the comparison with the show. First thing that is interesting is how technically the whole season 1 plot is basically the story of the first 4 issues from Marvel Premiere, which was the comic where Danny was introduced. The whole original run of Iron Fist happened during the issue 15 to issue 25 of Marvel Premiere, and unlike the show, it doesn't end with the death of Harold, but instead with the kidnapping of Colin Wing. Also, the hand isn't involved in Danny's or Kunlun's story at all. Another thing that surprised me the most was how they completely erased the sole reason for Danny to learn Kung Fu and acquire the Iron Fist to begin with. Because in the show, Danny doesn't learn about what Harold did until almost the end of season 1. So in the show, he effectively has no reason to learn how to fight or to leave Kunlun. They do try to say that a 10-year-old deduced that a plane wouldn't just go down by itself, so he wanted answers and that's the reason why he left the city. But that doesn't quite make sense. I am not saying that kids can't be smart, but I just didn't buy it. On the other hand, the whole still having Harold join Ward kind of makes sense, but it also wouldn't make sense why he didn't just ask to be taken home immediately after being rescued, since at least from Danny's perspective, he still had someone to go back to. Just feels like they didn't think this one through. They also, for whatever reason, decided to do a combination of different stories for Danny's origin. They took the whole crash into Kunlun from the 65th Iron Fist, Orson Randall, which, fun fact, was the first Westerner to wield the power. They also mixed in Wendell's story, which involved him trying to become the Iron Fist in order to fill a void within himself. Not to mention how they cut the whole connection Wendell had with Kunlun. It just feels too overcomplicated. Sometimes less is more, and in this case, is very apparent. Not to mention that in this version the Iron Fist is the protector of Kunlun, thing that just seems ludicrous to me. Why would a city that connects to Earth every 10 years need a protector for? More so when it's filled with Kung Fu masters, it just doesn't make sense. In comics, the Iron Fist is the champion of Kunlun, one of the 7 immortal weapons representing the 7 capital cities of heaven. This felt like they wanted to make Danny leaving the city more meaningful, but he was basically raised there, so it's not like that isn't reason enough to give Danny doubts or guilt about leaving. Hell, in comics, after he gives up his quest for revenge, he starts yearning for Kunlun, more so because he feels like he no longer belongs in New York. So they could have done the same story without making it be about a protector leaving his duty. Probably they just wanted to give a reason for why he was fighting the Hand, so it better fit in the plot for the Defenders show, but if they just stuck with the source material, they could have made it so that because Harold was preparing for Danny's return, he allied himself with the Hand and allowed them to use their company's resources in exchange for their services. So when Danny finally comes back to the company, he will see how the Hand was using it, and so in order to get rid of them, he will have to hunt them down. That way giving him a reason to ally himself with Daredevil, Luke, and Jessica. One of the things I hated the most from the adaptation was how they completely missed the point of Danny's story. In the original story, Danny ultimately spares Harold because he sees what obsession does, what continuing down that path will bring, and it just happens that karma catches up with Harold. But in the show, Danny just straight up takes revenge. By accident, mind you, but still. The whole point was for Danny to understand why revenge is pointless, so they completely missed the moral of the story, which in my opinion really took away from the story and the character. As for other characters, in my opinion only Ward got an upgrade from the source material. Like in comics, he's just an asshole for the sake of being an asshole. He doesn't care about others, doesn't have empathy or sympathy for others, and he has a meaningless death. Granted, he had some connections with the Skrulls, but overall he wasn't a great character, just an antagonist without much substance. In the show they do a better job with his portrayal, an abused victim trying to get control of his life, making some poor decisions along the way, but ultimately trying to be good, or at least good for the people he cares about. Harold is kind of the same as in the comics, if anything more devious and sinister. In the comics he was definitely petty, but in the show he's just straight up evil. Manipulating his family, metaphorically making deals with the devil, and messing with Danny's life at every turn. In comics at least he confronted Danny straight on, but in the show he's just afraid to get his hands dirty. I guess the main difference is how cowardly he is compared to the comic book version. They also changed the main reason why Harold killed Danny's parents, that being petty jealousy. Which wasn't a horrible change, but it just seems like an overkill for a character that was already unquestionably bad. Colleen Wing got an extremely big downgrade from the comics. She's just a brainwashed girl blindly supporting a bad cause and is barely making it on her own. While in comics, she is an independent woman that knows how to fight and has a successful business of her own. Hell, the only way Colleen could be brainwashed in comics was because a literal telepath took over her mind, and only after she was debilitated by drugs. There really isn't a comparison here. Show Colleen is just bad. Also, as a side note here, Colleen is more of a sister to Danny in the comics, so for me it's a bit weird how they changed their dynamic in the show. Joy kind of has the same role in the show as in the comics, more or less, so there isn't a lot to say there. In comics, she basically takes over the company after the death of Harold and seeks revenge against the Iron Fist because she believes he killed her dad. But she doesn't know Danny is the Iron Fist, so when he comes back to the company, they don't have issues with each other, besides the fact that Danny knows she is seeking revenge against him. She has a bigger role in the show, I guess, but there isn't much else, so for me this is more of a neutral change. Davos has a bigger role in Season 2 than Season 1, but the show version is basically a fusion of three characters from the comics. First one being Conal, that was Danny's best friend in Kundun, then obviously the character Davos, that was actually a friend slash rival of Wendell, Danny's father in case you forgot, when he lived in Kunlun. And to make a long story short, Wendell and Davos have a falling out, and for certain reasons Davos gets banished from Kundun. Lastly, there is Marin, which is basically a rival of Danny in Kundun, and he felt like Danny stole the power of the Iron Fist from him. Overall, nothing much to say here, besides the fact that, again, it just seems overly complicated for no reason. For Bakuro, the first thing I can say is that as far as I know, he and Danny never met in comics. However, he is a leader of a hand faction in comics, but that's about it. In the show, he is a bit of a mix between two characters, at least in my opinion. Angar, a guy with telepathic powers that, by the way, was the guy that brainwashed Colleen in comics, and also Colleen's dad, but more because of the father role he has with Colleen rather than as a character. At least this is how I interpret this version of the character. So maybe this was closer to Colleen's story in comics? I honestly couldn't tell because I don't know much outside the Iron Fist comics. Jerry Hogarth in comics is called Jerrin Hogarth or Jerrin Hogarth, and here is basically just a gender-bended version of the comic book character. And overall, she has the same role as in the comics, just helps Danny to get back in the company. And that's about it. I mean, after the character does have a bit of a bigger role in Danny's story, but in comparison to the show is basically the same. If anything, the show makes it harder for Danny to have access to his company, but that's really about it. I mentioned these characters because they are the most relevant for the comparison between the show and the comics. As I said, season 1 is basically an extended version of the first 4 issues in which Danny makes his first appearance. So as for characters like Claire, Madame Gao, Dr. Edmonds, and others, they are more of an addition of the show rather than accurate to the source material. Hell, by technicality, there's only 2 characters that really matter for the comparison, and those are Harold and Joy, since we don't see the Thunderer or UT. So overall, that's as far as the comparison goes character-wise. As for the plot, everything is just influenced by the comics but not accurate whatsoever. Danny becomes the Iron Fist for his revenge, he comes back to New York for his revenge, and ultimately gives up his revenge. The show is overall more convoluted in my opinion. Not everything was bad, mind you, like the whole confronting the trauma thing or finding a way to prove his identity were interesting ideas, but those would still work if the show was more comic book accurate. On the other hand, the prophecy thing wasn't great, as I believe it takes away from the achievement of earning the Iron Fist. Not to mention that in comics he's tremendously selfless and righteous, and if he was supposed to protect Kundun, he would, no matter what. Just to give you an example, in comics when Danny is looking for a kidnapped Colleen, he's forced to decide between following a lead or protect some people from imminent danger, and Danny chooses to help the people he doesn't even know, because he couldn't let innocence come to harm. So saying that he would leave his responsibility with the people that took him in and raised him over a very flimsy, not completely thought through, selfish need for answers that he isn't even asking, by the way, makes it seem like he only cares about himself. So again, not the best decision for the adaptation. It basically feels like they didn't even try to adapt this character, which probably was one of the main reasons the show was poorly received compared to the others. Something I did find out recently was that according to Finn Jones, the actor that played Danny Rand, they had to rush the entire first season because The Defenders was just around the corner. So maybe if they had enough time they wouldn't have made such bad decisions for the adaptation. Despite my complaints about the story, I do have to mention that acting wise, I think everyone did a great job. I believe the acting. I think that all the characters were portrayed perfectly. The only issue was that the story and the characters were poorly written. So they basically just needed more polishing and to be more accurate to the comics. As a final thought, I honestly hope they bring back Danny Rand with Finn Jones portraying him, because this character is 100% underappreciated and I think more people should learn about him, because his story is just that good. The one thing I would hope they do if they ever bring back the character to the MCU is that they should do a soft reboot. and just make it more accurate to the comics. Forget the whole prophecy thing, forget the whole hand thing, and bring back the revenge isn't worth it story. I doubt they will, since they canonize the Netflix shows and place them in the timeline. And if you don't believe me, and if you have it of course, go to Disney Plus, and in the Marvel section you can go to timeline order and you will find the Netflix shows placed there. But I still hope they do some level of rebooting, since I think that at least for Iron Fist it would be very beneficial. Not to mention that the original story is just way better. And yeah, that's about it. Hope you enjoyed the video, hope to see your thoughts in the comments, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.